Oh, hi, I'm Cory Doctorow, and I'm here to talk to you today about this book I wrote. It's called Choke Point Capitalism, and I co-wrote it with my friend Rebecca Giblin. She's a copyright scholar at the University of Melbourne. And we were motivated to write this book because we've kind of been in the trenches of the copyright wars for about 20 years. And you've probably experienced them, at least peripherally, these arguments about kind of who's in the right and who's in the wrong when it comes to Napster or YouTube or TikTok, when things should be taken down, when they should be left up, what is the best way to get artists paid, and how can we do it. And, we both knew that over 40 years in the United States and indeed over most of the world, we've just seen this incredible expansion of copyright. It lasts longer, it covers more things. You can enforce it without providing as much evidence. The statutory damages for people who violate your copyright are stronger than they've ever been. And yet, we both understood that the share of income going to creators has been in decline, even as the size of the industry itself has been growing. And we decided that we wanted to write a book that really dug into what we thought was going on behind the scenes, why it was that making copyright stronger was not making artists richer. And to boil it down to a nutshell, it's down to one word: monopoly. It's down to the fact that we have three giant record labels who own three giant music publishers. It's down to the fact that there are four giant book publishers, one giant book distributor, one national bookseller, one global ebook seller, two giant video services, two giant ad services, and so on and so on. Every part of the culture and entertainment industry is controlled by this very small number of companies. And when there's a small number of companies you have to bargain with in order for you as a creator to reach the audience who wants to enjoy your works and are willing to pay for it, then whatever copyright Congress or Parliament has given you is a copyright that these intermediaries, these people who sit at the choke point between you and your audience, can demand that you hand over as a condition of reaching them. Giving creators who exist in these choke point capitalist markets where the audience is on one side and the creators on the other, and there's this pinch in the middle that's controlled by these big companies, whether they're tech companies or entertainment companies. Giving us more copyright is like giving a bullied kid extra lunch money. It doesn't really matter how much lunch money you give the kid. All that matters is that the bullies are going to take whatever it is you give them. The only way to get your kid fed lunch is to make sure that the bullies are kept away from them. It's to restructure the way things work around the schoolyard. And so that's what we really set out to write about in the book, was on the one hand to describe how it is that these choke points operate, how their economics operate, how their funny accounting operates, how it doesn't matter whether it's a tech or an entertainment company that's doing the choking. They both have roughly the same set of incentives and roughly the same respect for creators, which is to say none. And then to talk about how we can resolve it. And that's really where I think this talk dovetails with the theme of this event, with the idea of ethical data. So let me give you some examples of how data interacts with these choke points and what we might do about them. You probably know that Amazon has a division called Audible. It's the largest audiobook retailer in the world. They account for about 90% of all audiobook sales. And they have a bunch of choke points. So for one thing, they just have the choke point that they are the first point of call and really the major place where people go when they're looking for audiobooks. The most economical way to use Audible is to take out a subscription. And that means that Audible has this kind of incentive built into its users to not look elsewhere, because at the start of every month, you've already bought an audiobook from Audible. And as you'll hear in a moment, maybe you've bought more than one, although you've only had to pay for one. And that means that people are unlikely to go outside of Audible because they start the month already effectively in debt to Audible. They need to choose an audiobook from Audible in order to be made whole, in order to make up for that money they've already spent. So creators are under enormous pressure to use Audible. But even more so, it's very hard to get people to leave Audible, to cancel those subscriptions. And that's because every audiobook that Audible sells comes wrapped up in something called digital rights management, a kind of encryption that locks it to Amazon's platform, because only Amazon's authorized audiobook players can play those encrypted audiobooks. And making a tool that can play those encrypted audiobooks without Amazon's permission is a crime under Section 1201 of the American Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or under Article 6 of the European Union's Copyright Directive. It is a crime, a felony. In the US, it's punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine to make a player for an Audible audiobook without Audible's permission. And that means that if you've bought $1,000 or €1,000 or £1,000 worth of Audible audiobooks, and I, as an Audible author, find someone who's willing to give me a larger share of what you spend, and I send out a message to all my loyal listeners and say, hey, why don't you take your audiobooks with you and join me over here on this other platform that sells audiobooks but gives creators a better deal, that you can't do that. You have to make a choice. Do you want to keep your audiobooks in the Audible platform and go and start another library somewhere else? Or do you want to buy all those books again on the new platform? Because only Amazon can authorize you to take your audiobooks with you when you leave Amazon. And Amazon isn't anxious to do that. Amazon wants to keep you locked into its platform. They want to make sure that you have what economists call a very high switching cost. So this means that creators find it very hard to leave Amazon, to resist Amazon. And Amazon knows it. And so it puts the screws to creators. And as with every time you see creators being punished, the ones with the weakest bargaining positions get punished first. They get the worst end of the deal. And it's used as a way to kind of knock the rough edges off of something awful that you want to do to everybody. This is a pattern we see in all kinds of technology. You know, if you want to track people, or say you wanted to watch people with a camera all the time, well, you know, we started doing that with people who were in detention centers and mental hospitals, and people who were in prison. And then we expanded it to kids who were in school, people who were shopping in merchants that cater to people who don't have a lot of money. And eventually we kind of expanded it to everywhere. I call this the shitty technology adoption curve. If you're going to do something bad to a lot of people, it makes sense to start with the people who don't get to complain. And that way you can kind of normalize it, knock the rough edges off of it. And the way the shitty technology adoption curve comes to Audible is they decided to start stealing from the creators who had the least leverage, who were the independent creators who use one of Audible's sub-platforms, something called ACX, the Audible Content Exchange. Audible Content Exchange, ACX, is a way for independent authors to connect with independent narrators and make their own audiobooks, which they finance out of their own pockets. And if you use ACX, you are locked to Amazon in two ways. The first is that you are not allowed to take that audiobook and upload it to anyone else's platform so they can sell it for 7 years. And the second is that while all of your books are being sold on Audible, they are sold to people locked with Audible's DRM, which means that even after 7 years, if you go somewhere else, people who've already bought your audiobooks can't take their audiobooks with them and follow you somewhere else. That's a very powerful form of lock-in. And these individual authors are very disorganized. They're not a group. They're not a union. They're not a guild. They're just a bunch of individual people who upload to the platform and don't have a ready way to find each other and make contact with each other. So Audible, this is where the data part comes in. Audible decided to start stealing from them. You'll recall that Audible's most valuable customers are the ones that take out a monthly subscription, and they get a credit every month that they can use to buy an audiobook. And at the end of that, Amazon offered them an incredibly generous deal. Once you had finished listening to your audiobook, Audible said to you, hey, if you were dissatisfied with that audiobook, you can return it and get your credit back. In fact, if you'd listened to that audiobook 6 times in a row, Amazon would still say, hey, if you were dissatisfied with that audiobook you've just listened to 6 times in a row, we'll give you a full refund. We'll give you your credit back. And because it's not Amazon giving them the refund, you don't get your subscription fee back. What happens is Amazon claws back the royalties that they would otherwise owe to these ACX authors who finance their own audiobooks out of their own pocket and who are not allowed contractually to take their audiobooks off of Amazon's platform for 7 years, and whose listeners are locked to Audible's platform forever and ever. Now, the ACX creators didn't know this. They didn't know this because of the way the data was handed to them. When Amazon showed them their royalty statement, they just gave them the net sales. So you might get a royalty statement that says that you just sold 10 audiobooks. What you don't know is that you sold 30 audiobooks, 20 of which were returned. And they could be returned 6 months after they were purchased. And so Amazon just tells you, oh, you've only had 10 sales. Now, the creators thought something was up, but it wasn't until a British Audible writer, an ACX writer named Susan May, got a royalty statement where Amazon had a glitch that showed 3 weeks worth of returns, which puzzled everybody on ACX because suddenly it showed that some of them had sold a negative number of audiobooks, which is a very hard thing to imagine doing. I know what it means to sell you an audiobook. I don't know what it means to sell a negative number of audiobooks. It wasn't until then that Susan and then her colleagues figured out what was going on with Amazon. And they started a hashtag Audiblegate, and they began to agitate for better treatment from Amazon. They began to spread the word that they were being stolen from by Amazon. And another Audible author, a retired forensic accountant, who'd become a mystery writer who wrote mysteries about financial fraud, Colleen Cross. She said, where there's smoke, there's fire. I'm going to have a harder look at these royalty statements and compare them to how Amazon says that it calculates our royalties. And on the basis of that, she believes that the total wage theft from ACX creators is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, both through this return scam. She thinks that maybe in many cases, the returns are being counted twice. So you sell 3 audiobooks. One of them is returned, but it's booked as a single audiobook sale, but also through other forms of accounting fraud. And it was only because the data came to light, only because there was this breach, this glitch, where 3 weeks worth of returns were shown on one statement, that any of this became possible. And now they've started to make some modest inroads. They've made some changes to the platform thanks to their pressure. The returns policy is changing, as are some of the other policies. It's getting a little better for ACX authors. More importantly, this was the instigating incident that sent a bunch of authors into each other's company and created a kind of powerful force where they are now gearing up to sue Amazon and demand better from Amazon. It also put facts and evidence, data, if you will, ethical data, about the unethical behavior of Amazon, which is now under consideration by regulators who are in charge of making sure that people aren't getting ripped off. Now, it's not just Audible that rips off authors and creators. It's all kinds of institutions that intermediate between creators and their audiences that pull this kind of scam. So if you are in a royalty arrangement with your publisher or your label or your studio, chances are that you have the legal right under your contract to audit that royalty statement, to go in and check the books. Now, most of us will never do this. It's very expensive to hire forensic accountants. They don't work cheap. But a lot of us end up getting to do so anyway. My professional association, the Science Fiction Writers Association, they have a kind of lucky dip where they pick one writer's name out of a hat periodically and pay to audit that author's royalty statements using a little bit of money from everybody's dues. Other creators are doing well. They make enough money that they can hire the auditors on their own. But here, too, they face some really serious structural impediments. If you go and you audit your own royalty statements and you discover that your publisher, your label, or your studio owes you money, the chances are they're not going to agree with you. They're not going to say, oh, well, you're absolutely right. You got me banged to rights. It's a fair cop. Here's the money we owe you. Instead, what they're going to say is, we think you've just read the statements wrong. And if you want us to just hand over all this money, you're going to have to sue us, which is something you probably can't afford to do. But because we're such good-natured slobs, we'll offer you a discounted settlement, something to make sure everybody is happy. But as a condition of that discounted settlement, we are going to bind you to a non-disclosure agreement so that your ethical data about how you've been robbed can't be shared with other people we also might be ripping off. You can't go out of this room where we're negotiating and find all the similarly situated creators and say, hey, I found some money that was stolen from me over there. You should go look too. You are prohibited from doing that. Not only that, but typically the royalty or the auditing system requires you not to use an auditor who's previously audited that firm. And so they are able to make sure that the ethical data about about where the funny accounting is going on, stays within the firm and doesn't go to the people who could use it the most. Now, this is a pretty widespread practice, this practice of screwing creators out of their royalties. We cited one report in our book from a firm that audits record label royalty statements, and they've done tens of thousands of these over decades. And in all of these, they've only found a single instance in which the accounting error was in the favor of the recording artist. In every other instance, in those tens of thousands of audits where they found an error, it was in the favor of the label. Now, this is an incredible coincidence, and I can only assume that it's the result of a highly localized probability storm. But, when we spoke to someone who had found a six-figure error in their favor, they were quite offended by the fact that they couldn't go out and tell other people about where that money was and where they should go and look at it. And so the second half of our book of Choke Point Capitalism is devoted not to just telling stories about how artists got screwed, but describing regimes under which we can make it easier for them to not get screwed. And so in this case, we describe how you could pass very short bills in a small number of states that would make this kind of theft impossible to sustain. Because the entertainment industry is so monopolized, nearly every contract that involves a royalty statement is consummated in California, New York, Washington State because of Amazon, or Tennessee because of Nashville and the country music industry. And if in those four states you were to introduce a short bill that said it is against public policy to enforce non-disclosure agreements where they pertain to material omissions or misstatements in royalty statements that result in harms to the creators who are owed royalties, passing those four short bills would put more money into the pockets of more artists, not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world, because that's where these companies are headquartered, than all of the copyright term extensions of the last 40 years combined. So let's talk about some of the other scams and some of the other ways that data could help fix it. Over the last 40 years, the expansion of copyright has meant that when an entertainment company is able to take the copyrights from its creators, those copyrights turn out to be very powerful weapons to attack other firms in the sector, to structure their industry. So for 40 years, the record industry has been able to both consolidate and to gather copyrights that are more powerful because they're so consolidated with only 3 record labels and 3 music publishers that everyone who wants to be a musician to a first approximation has to sign a record deal. And when they do, they sign away all those rights to their label and their publisher. That means that anyone who wants to make a streaming music company needs to go to those 3 companies, the Warner, Sony, Universal triopoly that controls 70% of the world's recorded music. And that means that they have a lot of power over how companies like Spotify are going to do business. So when Spotify was getting off the ground, they ended up having to sell large equity stakes to those 3 record labels. The 3 record labels, in turn, offered them what seemed like a pretty good deal. They said, we are going to take a very low rate per stream in royalties for the music from our catalog that you play on your streaming service. We're going to do that, but we are also going to require of Spotify a minimum monthly payment. So that means that perhaps you're going to give us $70 million every month. But because the streams themselves are so cheap, all of the Sony or Warner or Universal music that is played on your platform in that month only adds up to $35 million, which means that out of the $70 million you give us, $35 million of it is unattributed royalties. We don't have to give that to the artists. We can give that to one artist or no artists, or we can give that to a few artists whom we favor, or we can just trouser it. We can give it to our shareholders. It's our money. And in addition to that, we are going to demand what's called the most favored nation status with Spotify. And that means that Spotify cannot offer a higher per stream rate to any of the other record labels, the tiny independent record labels and musicians who account for the 30% of recorded music that Sony, Warner, and Universal don't control. And so that meant that they too were all earning these very small sums from the royalties from the streams on Spotify. However, they were not privy to these minimum monthly guarantees. So that was all they got. They didn't get any unattributable royalties that they could just trouser or disperse among their artists. And so that meant that not only did Universal and Sony and Warner get a lot of money and their artists got very little, it also meant that Spotify looked very profitable on paper because due to these low per stream rates and due to this most favored nation status, Universal, Sony, and Warner were able to make Spotify look like it didn't have to pay much per stream, which meant that all of the dollars it brought in from advertising and subscriptions were more profitable than they would have seemed if they'd had to negotiate fairly for all those streaming rates. And that meant that when Spotify went public, when it had its IPO, that these three companies, as major shareholders in Spotify, all got billions of dollars because Spotify looked more profitable. Now, all of that only came to light, or the substantial and most sleazy elements of it only came to light when Sony suffered a massive data breach, an unethical data release that resulted in some ethical data production, that resulted in musicians learning about this unattributed royalty scam. And that led to the end of the unattributed royalty scam and significant improvements in creators' lives. Now, the Spotify problem is not just a problem of the three giant record labels only being willing to deal with Spotify and a few other companies, but that is a major part of the problem. The fact that there aren't a lot of places where fans and musicians can go to negotiate better deals for fans, better deals for musicians, better deals for everyone except for a few oligopolies that sit in between them at these choke points, is a real problem with the livelihood of musicians, of recording artists, of composers, and of everyone else in the industry. So one way that you could get more competition, one way that you could get more firms in the sector, is through a tried and true method called blanket licensing. If you've ever turned on the radio and heard someone call up and request a song and then the DJ plays it, or if you've ever been in a live venue where the barista at the cafe or the DJ spinning for the dance club just pulls any music that they want and puts it on over the PA system, you may have wondered, how is it that they can do this without getting a license to those individual songs? Why is it that when it's open mic karaoke night and someone gets up on stage to sing some Bob Dylan, that the barman doesn't have to pick up the phone and call Bob Dylan's manager and ask how much it's going to cost for that live performance of a Bob Dylan song there in the bar? And the answer is blanket licensing. Musicians and other rights holders club together. They nominate a rights society, a single entity that goes out and offers a license to the entire catalog of all music to all of these venues, which makes it possible for there to be lots of places where music is played, which means that you don't get one place that just corners the market on this. This is not just about making sure that there's pleasant music in cafes and bars and clubs. This is also about making sure that one kind of business doesn't gain control over the whole record industry. I mean, imagine if there was only one chain of nightclubs that had the license to play all the popular music. That chain of nightclubs would become kind of tastemakers. They could charge lots of money to the musicians for the right to have their music played in the club, right? They could reverse that dynamic. Instead of paying for the right to play music, they could charge for the right to expose club goers to the music. And they could say, "What? Look, if you want to be doomed to obscurity, then fine, don't pay us, and we just won't have your music played in front of all the people who go to hear music played at a dance club, which means that your music will just disappear." So having lots of places, having any place that wants to be a place that can play live music be able to do so, is key to making sure that musicians and their industry are not captured by someone else in their supply chain. And we could do this for the internet. There are some issues with this. Some musicians make a good living by never selling to the streaming media platforms. Some musicians are only, for example, available to buy their records on Bandcamp. We shouldn't force those into the streaming license, but we could have a rule that said once there's a streaming service that is streaming your music, then it goes into the catalog and you're entitled to a share of the music. And that share could be calculated fairly by the collecting society rather than by your label or by Spotify, because Spotify and the labels don't calculate your share fairly. You would think if every time you turn on Spotify, you play, your favorite band, some band you listen to in school, the Honey Roasted Landlords, that at the end of the month, the $15 that you've given to Spotify is turned over to the Honey Roasted Landlords, less the percentage that Spotify takes for administering the service. But that's not how it works at all. What happens is that the label looks at all of the streams that have been logged for its catalog on Spotify and all of the money it got for those plays, and that it apportions the money based on that proportionate play, which means that even if you listen to Honey Roasted Landlords with Every Hour That God Sends, chances are all of the money that you've given to Spotify is going to end up in the pocket of someone like Kanye West, right? It's a rich get richer phenomenon. Now, the collecting societies could do a better job. Historically, they haven't. Historically, they have been pretty inefficient. And here again, we see an opportunity for ethical data. It turns out that these rights societies in every country maintain their own clunky, error-riddled database of who is the rights holder to which music. And they frequently claim that they can't find obscure musicians like Britney Spears. They've just never heard of her, and they don't know where to send her check. Now, this is obviously ridiculous, and there's no reason we couldn't have a single global system that maintains all of this data, that's run by a cooperative or a nonprofit of different rights societies, and that the rights societies themselves could be more transparent, could produce more ethical data about what money they take in and how they disperse it. We could also backstop that with rules. We could say to collecting societies, if you have unattributable royalties, you are not allowed to use that to pad the salaries of the people who work at the collecting society. Instead, all of that money has to go into a business that tracks down missing rights holders, right? It just has to go into building the database and making it better, fixing the holes in it. That's the only thing you can use it for. If that were the case, we could see much fairer dispersals to creators and a much wider and more open platform where creators and audiences could come together. We could bust open those choke points. Now, I want to, as I move towards the end of this talk about what kind of data shouldn't exist, what is unethical data, and what data we should just not produce, and if we produce it, we should not retain. And I consider this part of my ongoing project to rehabilitate the poor Luddites. You probably think that the term Luddite means someone who's technophobic, someone who doesn't believe in progress. But that's far from the case if you think about the historic role of the Luddites. The Luddites were weavers. They were textile workers who saw their jobs being dismantled because the factory owners were putting automation in their factories. They were buying steam looms and stocking frames that made it much faster and easier to produce the textiles that these weavers had produced for generations. Now, the profits that the factory owners used to buy these machines were the result of the labor that these workers had put in. Right? They had done the work that produced the profits, that produced the machines, that procured the machines. And they didn't object to the machines. They would have been very glad to see their workload get lighter. What they objected to was being made redundant. What they objected to was being told, instead of working half as many hours to produce twice as much material that would then produce the same wage for you, but more material prosperity for everyone who needed textiles, instead we're just going to make 3/4 of you redundant. And we're going to trouser the additional profits. And they went out and they smashed the looms. They set fire to factories. But they weren't anti-technology activists. Their cause was not the destruction of powered looms, no more than, say, Osama bin Laden's cause was the end of civilian aviation. For them, smashing looms was a tactic and not the goal. The goal was to make some technologies obsolete and to make other technologies rearranged so that the who they served changed. And a lot of this talk has been about the Luddite project of changing whom technology serves, not getting rid of streaming music, but making streaming music fairer. But this part of the talk is going to be about which part of the system we should just get rid of, which part of the system we just shouldn't build. And for that, I'm going to talk about Amazon. When Amazon talks to its shareholders about how its business works, they use the metaphor of a flywheel. Flywheel is a big inertial wheel that once it gets spinning, stays spinning, and you just keep getting it spinning faster and faster, and it builds up its own inertia and keeps going. And Amazon's flywheel says, well, over here, we have a bunch of vendors who want to sell to us. And so that puts a lot of stuff into our platform. And then over here, we have a bunch of customers who want to buy the things that the vendors are selling. And then over here, we have our negotiating leverage that comes from having all of these customers, and we can use that to make the costs lower. And then because we have more customers, we have more merchants who come in, which brings in more customers, which makes the cost lower, which brings more merchants in, and so on and so on. The flywheel spins and spins. But another way of talking about that is over here, we have some locked in customers, customers who start the year having spent however much, $150 on Prime, money that they have to can only justify if they stay in the system and order everything from Amazon. We have merchants who no longer have high street retailers where they can sell their goods because all the business has gone to Amazon, and they can be forced into unsustainable discounts from Amazon, discounts so low that the merchants can't afford to manufacture their goods and still turn a profit, but also can't afford not to be on Amazon. And so they get onto Amazon, and their prices are so low that people come and join Amazon and get locked in. And then that allows more merchants to, or that requires more merchants to come in because there's nowhere else to sell their goods because all the customers are locked in. That makes Amazon screw them out of even bigger concessions, which means that their profit basis is eroded even further. And eventually, Amazon, which can not only operate this platform, but monitor it, can drive these merchants out of business and then turn around and say, well, we know all the people who buy their goods. We know who all their suppliers are. We know where they get their goods manufactured because we've arm twisted them into using fulfillment through Amazon, which is the only way to get on the front page of Amazon. So they direct ship from their factories to our warehouses. So we know where their goods come from. We know what factory to go to. And now that they're either nearly out of business or absolutely out of business, we can manufacture their goods as Amazon original goods. And you see this not just with hard goods, USB cables and shoes and suitcases, but you see it with books and audiobooks. Amazon knows more about the book business than any of the publishers because they know to the minute who's buying books. They know where they are. They know what search terms they use. If they use a Kindle, they know how they read the book, every page they read, where they are when they read it, what they go back and reread, what they highlight, whose house they visit while they're reading it because of the IP address and so on. They store all that data and analyze it. The publishers have none of that. And Amazon is a publisher. They don't just serve as a conduit to sell Kindle books or Audible books. They also make their own Audible books and Kindle books, and they compete directly with the publishers. So they have data that the publishers don't have, and they have data that other kinds of merchants don't have. And this is data that shouldn't exist. Or rather, if it exists, it should exist in the hands of nonprofits. It should be in the hands of customers, but it should not be in the hands of an intermediary who competes with these firms, because it means that it can extinguish these firms. And when it does, it can put the screws to us, and it can put the screws to the creators who supply it. And that's just data that shouldn't exist. Now, Amazon insists that it can handle this data fairly. It insists that it can run the platform and sell on the platform at the same time without ever having a conflict of interest. This is like insisting that a referee can own one of the teams on the field. And that's just not something that a referee can fairly do. Two solicitors from the same firm can't represent the same couple in a divorce. A judge can't hear a case involving her son. And platforms should not be competing with the people who use their platforms. This is a very old principle in law. Back before we neutered antitrust in the Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan years, we had a principle called structural separation, where platforms could not compete with the users of platforms. Rail companies couldn't own freight companies that competed with their freight customers, and banks couldn't own businesses that competed with the businesses that borrowed money from them, because it would let them choose winners in the marketplace. It would let them structure whole markets and decide how the markets were going to work, not on the basis of what customers desired, nor on the basis of what was good for suppliers, but what was good for them. And that is another solution that we talk about in our book. So all told, the book has about a dozen big policy solutions in it. And when we shopped the book around, one of the editors that we sent it to said, I really like this book, but I can't publish it because all of the solutions that you propose, they're not individual solutions, they're structural solutions. And individuals are going to be frustrated that there's nothing they can personally do to fix this. And we were like, man, you are so close to getting it. You're right. Individuals can't individually solve any of these problems because these are not individual problems. You can't recycle your way out of climate change. You can't shop your way out of a monopoly. And you can't just be a shrewd seller of your goods and get away from these monopsonies, these choke points where there's just one buyer for your labor. These have to be resolved through structural means. Your kid isn't going to get lunch by you giving them more lunch money. In order to get more lunch money, in order to get your kid lunch, you're going to have to work with the school to get the bullies away from the lunchroom so that the kid can get from your house to the lunchroom and still buy their lunch. Now, I think this is characteristic of a lot of data issues, that data is not an individual sport, it's a team sport. Whether we're talking about privacy, whether we're talking about data that relates to the climate emergency or data about labor, these are never individual issues. These are always big structural issues. And the only thing we can do as individuals is start thinking of ourselves as part of a movement. And so that's what I'm going to close with. The only way we're going to resolve this is not by seeing ourselves as atomized individuals like those ACX authors who are having their wages stolen. It's only by coming together that we're going to be able to make a difference. Thank you.